All right. Good afternoon, all. Thank you for joining us for another installment of Wild at Work. Today we have a couple of guests to introduce. We have Mrs. Brittany Chesser and Dr. Todd Sink with the Department of Rangeland, Wildlife, and Fisheries Management at Texas A&M. Thank both of them for joining us today. We are going to ask that participants remain muted with their cameras off for the remainder of the presentation. However, you will have access to the chat feature of Zoom. You can go ahead and drop any questions you have in there. We'll also be sending some links out throughout the presentation. And so with that, Todd and Brittany, I'll go ahead and let y'all take over, and I'm going to try to disable the waiting room here so that folks can kind of filter in as we go. Let me stop my screen share.
Awesome, thank you. We'll go ahead and put it up there on the screen. So thank you for the introduction. Like Jared mentioned, my name's Brittany Chesser, and we also have Dr. Todd Sink here. We'll be both kind of going back and forth just because we do have different specialties throughout the aquatics realm. And so we really wanted to put this together just because we do offer several other programs throughout the year that get really specific, but there really isn't a medium just in terms of, an introduction to some of the pond resources that are out there and just in general how to get started for new pond owners or, maybe you're someone who's owned a pond for a long time, but you just haven't had necessarily the time or the resources to put anything in it. And now you're really trying to go back and revisit that a little bit more. So first I want to direct you to our main resources. So we have our two different websites that are listed here, and most of the links that Jared's going to help us out by putting into the chat can also be found within these two websites. They house a lot of our information. So this is aquaplant.tamu.edu. This is where we have information on aquatic vegetation. We have over 250 ID profiles with key characteristics listed. So if you have a problematic type of aquatic vegetation in or around your pond, you can go out and it'll help you ID that because that is critical. The first step in management we're going to talk about a little bit later. And then each of those ID profiles have a management page that links at the bottom. And so this will just show the known effective management options for each of those species. In my opinion, a little bit biased because I do run the website now, but a really good tool. We also have our fact sheets on there. We also have our pond management company list. So if you're someone that maybe isn't looking to do the work yourself, we do have a known list of pond and lake management companies. We have online courses. We have ways to connect with your local county extension office. On the other side of that, you'll see our fisheries.tamu.edu webpage. And both of these, again, are kind of linked back to each other. But this is where we have our aquatic diagnostics lab, which we'll talk about a little bit more. This is where it's housed. We have different fish species profiles. So if you're wanting to look into, different fish in terms of stocking into your pond, this would be a really good one to reference. And then we also have a ton of fact sheets that are pertinent to different categories on this web page. So water quality, overall pond management, it breaks it out into different categories. And they're not only from Texas A&M, but they're from other reputable resources or sources and universities as well. We also have a fish supplier list that's listed on there. So we'll be touching on several of these, and just know that if you want to know anything more about our program, you could probably look at these two websites and get a better idea. We will have QR codes throughout the presentation. Feel free to use them if you are someone who uses QR codes. But that's why we also have the links posted in the chat. And so one of the biggest things, you'll see this QR code throughout most of our presentation. And this particular QR code will actually bring up our Aquaplant webpage tab, our fisheries webpage tab, and then some of our main fact sheets that we're going to cover. And a really big component If you're someone that wants to keep up with our programs, we do have an Aqua Extension newsletter. And so we highly recommend that you subscribe to that newsletter if you want to stay up to date with what webinars we're going to be offering, field days, and also we put in different articles, just what we're doing around the state. So you also get some information that way. And then of course, when we create new fact sheets, you'd be the first one to know. I'm the one who runs that, and I do not I do not like to spam people. So that is something that is only done a maximum of 2 times a month. So I'm not someone that you're going to be hearing from every single week. I just want to let you know that because I know some people are just getting loaded down with emails. Okay. So we do have, again, our aquaculture, fisheries, and management website. We have more than 1,200 resources available on that web page. Then our aquaplant website, again, over 240 aquatic plant species listed. Then we have our aquatic diagnostics laboratory, which Dr. Sink is going to talk about a little bit more here in a minute, but this is where we have water quality testing along with nutrient testing for ponds where your primary goal is for a fisheries. Okay, so if you're trying to look for water testing related to irrigation or livestock, there's other labs that would be of benefit. Our aquatic diagnostics lab specifically focuses on deciding and recommending and providing amendments for water, again, specifically tailored to a fisheries. We also do clearing muddy ponds and liming recommendations. So if you're someone that has a super turbid pond and you're trying to figure out how to clear it, we do have a water clearing treatment test. And then we also have fish disease and parasite diagnostics. We have an in-house vet. So if that's something interesting to you, feel free to check that link out in the chat. I do also want to put that we do several in-person programs that are 100% related to ponds. So maybe you'll get a bite of it today and then you want to dive more into it. And so this year coming up in 2025, we'll be doing a more bass, less grass pond workshop on March 24th in Beaumont, Texas. This is where if you're a private applicator, we'll be giving out 5 CEUs for this program. We'll be covering a lot of different topics, a little bit more in depth than we will today. Aquatic vegetation ID and management, fish stocking strategies, fish management strategies, biological controls, so using our herbivorous fish. And then what's really cool, and you can kind of see this here on our photo here, we have demonstrations. So we have local companies that come out, and at our last workshop, we had an electrofishing demonstration where we had people actually go out on the boat with these experts, grab some fish, and we were able to put them up on the bank and kind of just go over species ID, right? And then also go over or assess the population a little bit more. So really interesting. We also will have some mechanical vegetation removal demos as well, just to kind of wrap up the program, do some more hands-on, get you guys outdoors. So this link here over to the right links to some more information about that. So just to continue a little bit, we do have an aquatic webinar series. This is highly management oriented. So we do, give you some background concepts, but really here's the problem. Why is this a problem? Okay, how do you fix it? And this is roughly around every third Tuesday, every month. It does change just based on some conflicting conferences. And we usually start at 6 p.m. and we usually run in terms of our actual program until 7:30, and then we basically stay on for as long as there's questions, which usually is 30 minutes to an hour. We have not only a wide state audience, a national audience, but we actually have an international audience for these series. So it's really cool because we get a lot of participation, a lot of perspectives just in terms of pond management globally. And so we do have our list for 2025. We just put this together. So feel free to take a picture of this, but you'll also see this on our resources as well. And for some of these webinars, we also offer continuing education units for private pesticide applicators. And so that's where you'll see these asterisks. So if you join our aquatic webinar, our aquatic newsletter, we'll be sending out kind of a email blast at the beginning of December when registration opens. So another thing we want to point out is that if you are not aware, so since we are with Texas A&M AgriLife Extension, you have a local ag and natural resources county extension agent. Okay, so there are 1.3 million ponds in Texas. We'll go over our specialists that we have here in a second, but it's really hard for the three of us to address or conduct site visits for all of the issues dealing with these 1.3 million ponds in Texas, right? And so we really rely on our local county extension agents to be ears and eyes. And really our clients are supposed to be our extension agents. And so we recommend that if you have not made contact with your local agent, that you go ahead and you go on, click this link and find your local agent and just get, kind of a relationship with them. Make sure that you stay up to date with the events that they're having. A lot of the questions that we get, we feel really bad, but again, we're statewide, so it might take us several weeks before we can answer back on some of these questions that your agent could have probably answered pretty easily within a day or two. Okay, so just to go over our different specialists, we have Dr. Todd Sink, who's going to talk to you here in a second. He is technically our aquaculture extension specialist. He is statewide when it comes to aquaculture production, water quality for fisheries. He's the director of our aquatic diagnostics lab. He's also statewide for fish diseases and fish kills, and any difficult to manage or treat pond issues are also sent to him. So if you send me something a little bit more complex, you might see that Todd gets copied in on that email. In terms of his pond stocking and fish management strategies, specialty, he deals with the Southeast and Central Texas. That is kind of his realm for those issues. Myself, I'm the Aquatic Vegetation Management Program Specialist, and so I am statewide when it comes to aquatic vegetation, ID, and management issues, and I also help with water quality for fisheries working through the Aquatic Diagnostics Lab. We recently hired on another program specialist. This is Tyson Keys, and he is located in the Northeast Texas region with his specialty in pond stocking and fish management strategies. We also want to point out we get a lot of questions related to ponds siting, design, construction, and repair. And we cannot answer those questions. That is tasked by our federal agency, the Natural Resource Conservation Service. And so we recommend if you are looking for any structural pond construction or maintenance consultations, that you reach out to your local NRCS office. Many of their services are free and they have the right experts that are soil scientists and civil engineers. We're really not specialized in any of those fields. So it's actually really for the best that you go to them. Okay, so we do have some resources just in terms of if you're trying to figure out where to start, and we'll kind of reference these throughout the rest of the presentation, but our landowner's guide to aquatic site visits. So if you're someone that is going to one of us or your agent and you want to provide them with some background information to kind of really expedite things or speed things along, the landowner's guide will kind of walk you through some of the key information that any of us are going to need to really help you out. If you are a professional in the field, we also have kind of the equivalent of that, our aquatic site visit checklist for professionals as well. Okay, so now I'm going to kind of pass the baton to Dr. Sink to start talking.
All right, thank you, Brittany. Apologize, we're going to do a couple of these swaps throughout. We're both using the same computer in a very small office, so we're rolling around the room here. When we were asked to give this program, we were kind of like, wow, how do we narrow this down into something meaningful and useful for the audience? Because quite honestly, my standard program, I give about 5 hours of programming in fisheries management and water quality. Brittany easily could do 5 hours in aquatic vegetation management. And to be honest with you, even people that go through these trainings maybe not learn 50% of really what they need to learn to manage a pond. And so really this webinar is not highly management focused. What this is we decided to develop a program for maybe newer pond owners or those constructing new ponds, or maybe you've bought a property and you know nothing about the pond, or you've had a pond on your property for 10 years and you've never managed it and you just kind of want to know where to get started. This program is really to help you evaluate that pond. What do you have? What are the issues? Where do you get started? And then we also are going to show you the resources available to you based on the issues you determine that might be occurring in your pond and where to get more information. Because we had to do something that fits, in this nice 45, 50-minute window. So we decided to break it down in that manner. And so when it comes to evaluating a pond, this might, like I said, you might be a new landowner. You could be constructing a new pond. You may have a pond on your property you just want to suddenly start managing. Well, most people make the mistake. The first thing they do is they walk up to the pond and they start looking at the pond and deciding what the issues are. They've missed 90% of the picture. We always tell people that when you start to evaluate a pond, the first step is you need to examine the region of the state, the location, and the surrounding landscape. These are important. The reason why is the nearby land uses can increase the management intensity and cost. If there's things like major construction, agriculture occurring, livestock use around the pond or in the watershed, these are all things that have direct influence on your pond and can cause issues. So you need to know what the issues in the landscape are before you start evaluating the pond. So make a note, and a great tool for doing this is just simply jump on Google Earth or Google Maps or anything that has a satellite image of your pond and look at the surrounding area. So what are some of the nearby land uses? Are there row crops, livestock, golf courses, housing developments? All of these things can lead to increased rates of sedimentation. They can lead to increased nutrient loads. They can cause things like water loss. So all these are things that could impact that pond. So like I said, use Google Earth or other satellite tools to determine nearby land uses that may cause conflict or issues with your pond. Kind of the next step, look at the water. Is the water clear? Is it turbid? Is it choked with vegetation? What is the color and the clarity of the water telling you? Does it have the potential for undesired species invading the pond? And this again is something where one of those satellite imagery tools is really good. So here, let's just take, for example, here I just randomly selected a Google Earth image and it shows many ponds located around. But as you can see, right here in the middle, we have two ponds located very close together. Maybe the pond in the dead middle is your property, and the one directly to the right is on a neighbor's property. Well, if you're having a management issue with a fish that's invading, possibly non-native aquatic vegetation, some nutrient issues, if you're only managing your pond and your property right here, well, there's high potential for that pond to just be reinfested by your neighbor's pond directly upstream. So this may be an issue where you need to evaluate the whole landscape and maybe talk to surrounding properties, surrounding land managers to help manage your pond and their ponds and aquatic systems more holistically so that everyone has less issues. You also need to know what is the typical rainfall for the region or county. Our counties in East Texas have much higher rainfall than those in West Texas. And so that changes the size of the pond that the watershed can support. In East Texas, it may only take 5 to 6 acres of watershed to keep a 1 acre pond full, whereas in parts of West Texas, it may take 25 to 30 acres of watershed just to keep 1 acre pond full. So you really need to know what is the rainfall and the precipitation in your county or region. Um, the next thing you need to do is really sit down and kind of have a heart-to-heart talk with yourself and your family, and evaluate what are your management goals. And the reason for this is each pond owner may have different opinions about their pond. And that all depends on what your personal management goals are. Your primary management goal may be livestock watering, or it may be fishing, or it may be other forms of recreation, or it may be wildlife hunting or viewing. It may be crop or row crop or greenhouse irrigation, lawn irrigation. There's lots of different potential uses, and those uses can actually conflict with each other in terms of management. So it's important for you to sit down and say, what is my primary management objective for this pond? What is my secondary? What is my tertiary, if there are three? And then we need to start building your management plan based on what your primary goals are. Because I'll tell you, if your primary goal is to manage that pond to keep water in it and keep it full for livestock watering, it's going to be a completely different management plan than if your primary goal is to grow trophy bass. So determine your specific uses and goals for the pond before any assumptions are made about what you need to do to that pond. Far often, too many times people walk up to a pond and go, "Oh, it's muddy, I need to clear it." Why? If you're watering livestock in it and they're entering that pond every day and they're stirring it up, you're just wasting money for something that's just going to be a recurring issue. So that's just one example of, you really need to determine your management goals before you make assumptions about what you need to do to your pond. Okay, you need to determine what is the main use of the water. Irrigation, livestock watering, fishing, wildlife viewing, fire prevention or mitigation, recreational water sports such as swimming, boating, or kayaking. We even deal with a lot of landowners that still use ponds for human consumptive use. It's their primary water source. Well, that's going to limit a lot of things like chemicals or herbicides that you can apply to that pond as well. Like I said, determine if there is secondary or even tertiary uses. Sometimes these can be managed concomitantly with your primary use, but other times there can be direct conflicts, and so we have to do some give and take on our management style. Next, we need to determine what is the size of the pond. So first of all, we need to know what is the average depth of the pond. We need to know the mean depth. Far too often when we show up, people will tell us the maximum depth of the pond. Well, the maximum depth of the pond we can't really use to calculate volume, so it's not going to tell us anything about water treatment, application, or those types of things. So we need to carefully determine what the average depth is. The other issue is most people don't realize that from the day you build a pond and it begins to fill, it is slowly being sedimented in. The average lifespan of a pond is only 25 to 100 years without proper management. It will eventually slowly fill in and become a wetland. And so if you give me the specs of the maximum or mean depth of your pond when it was constructed 10 years ago, that really doesn't tell me anything because that pond is likely 3 foot shallower throughout the entire pond at that point in time. So you can do many methods. You can use a string and a rock and do the grid method. You can use a boat sonar. There's many ways to determine depth, but you need to determine the average depth of your pond. Next you need to determine, are there any obvious slope or erosion issues? We see this a lot with livestock operations or ponds that are built into hillsides. We often see bare slopes, erosion because the cattle or livestock or other livestock, sometimes even wildlife, feral hogs can create those trails and cuts that cause erosion. There may be plowing or other tillage methods in the landscape that are causing erosion methods. So signs of erosion issues are banks with a slope of more than 2 to 1, undercut banks, large areas of shallow water or shallow tapering banks, cattle paths, or gullies and washes. Dredging, digging, and slope and dam repair are expensive endeavors, and they cost several $1,000s per acre to repair or correct. I kind of liken this. This is one of the things that when you're purchasing or thinking about purchasing a new property that has an existing pond, you really need to evaluate the structural integrity of that pond, because it's kind of like if you buy the property and the slope is eroded on the dam or there's structural issues with the dam, it's kind of like buying a new house only to have to replace the roof or install a new HVAC system. That's a substantial cost that might be $20,000, $30,000 above and beyond what the purchase price was. That's a maintenance cost that has to be factored in. And so next thing you need to determine is also look at the water source. And we need to understand, why is it important to determine who owns the water? Well, surface water flowing in a watercourse on your land is actually state property. The state owns it once it enters a watercourse. So water flowing across your property may not be yours. You may not have a right to use that water for your pond. If a pond is filled with water from a watercourse, a state water right permit is required. Texas law provides an exemption from the state water permit process for small ponds used for domestic livestock, uh, wildlife, and fish purposes with less than 200 acre-feet of storage capacity. So in other words, you can basically have a 20-acre pond or lake that averages about 10 foot deep, and you're under that, you're within that 200 acre feet. Now, if you're somebody that has like a 30, 40 acre pond, you're probably going to have different permits from the state because you're storing in excess of what the exemption is for. Diffuse surface water, in other words, rainfall or other forms of precipitation that fall on your land, is private property of the landowner before it enters a watercourse. So as long as it falls onto your land in the watershed and it rolls down into your pond, that's fine. That is your water. But if it rolls down your property into a stream and then enters your pond, you're actually damming state water. Oops. Groundwater is private property of the landowner, but subject to regulations of local groundwater conservation districts. Texas law provides exemption from the groundwater district permit process for wells producing less than 25,000 gallons per day that are used to fill ponds used for domestic and livestock purposes only. So within that small pond, or what we refer to as the stock tank exemption, landowners can lose the exemption if the pond is used for purposes other than domestic and livestock or fish and wildlife. So we got an example here. If a landowner decides to use an exempt pond for irrigating a golf course or a cash crop, say he's got a greenhouse that he sells plants at the local farmer's market in, they must obtain a permit for the new use. It's no longer covered under the exemption. Exempt ponds must be used for non-commercial purposes. Wildlife ponds on property leased for hunting do not constitute a commercial use under this law. So yes, you can sell the waterfowl hunting rights to a pond on your property and not violate the exemption. Landowners can consult quadrangle maps provided by the United States Geological Survey. It looks very much like this map here on the bottom left. It's just a random one I pulled up off their website. Maps often indicate the presence of a water course. Perennial and intermittent streams are shown in blue on maps. And so here we have a perennial stream that is a solid blue line flowing on this map. And then we have these intermittent streams, which are shown in the dashed line on the map. So if water enters any of these things that are shown in blue, including this wetland, this is the wetland symbol down below Willow Lake, you are using water in a water course, and that is state-owned water. Now, here's the issue. You can use these maps for reference, but it's always good to consult with the USGS or NRCS because it may take a hydrologist, an official with TCEQ, or ultimately a court to determine if surface water is flowing in a water course. In other words, some of these kind of small kind of depressions on your landscape, you may not consider it a water course, but the court may consider it a water course. Management of aquatic vegetation in public water requires special permits. So that's an issue. We have people all the time that maybe live on like one of these large public reservoirs or on a river or a stream or a creek, or they have a pond on their property that is constructed on a dammed creek. And once again, remember that dammed creek may be accepted, but it's still state-owned water. you have to have special permits in order to manage the vegetation on that because the vegetation and fish within state waters belong to the state. You may not be allowed to treat or manage fish or plants at all, depending on what the regulatory agency that manages those resources says. So in both these cases, it would be TPWD that you would need permits to manage, and they do have the right to say, no, that plant is fine, we're not managing it, or yes, we're going to approve, but you must follow the established state plan guidelines for treatment. So this is often an issue for landowners that think they own the water, but really the state owns it. Groundwater is privately owned, but subject to local regulations. The ownership rule must be considered in connection with law of capture and subject to regulations by local groundwater conservation districts. What that means is you technically cannot use more than potentially could be captured on your land. So if we look at the annual precipitation maps, we know how much precipitation falls in your county, and you have 10 acres, then we can calculate how much water can be captured on your land annually, and that's the amount you're allowed to use. You cannot use in excess of it. Groundwater Conservation District's authority to manage, conserve, and protect groundwater resources, including limiting the amount of groundwater that a landowner may pump from beneath their land. This is important for filling ponds, those people that use wells to fill ponds. Landowners cannot waste water or pump excessive amounts to maliciously harm their neighbor. And you would think, who would do that? But yes, we run into cases all the time where people will literally run a well constantly to make it so that their neighbor's well will go dry when there's land disputes. We've seen it many times before. It does happen. And so if this all seems a little bit confusing to you or you just need more information, you can go ahead and see our publication called A Pond to Call My Own, Understanding Water Law in Texas. And it's a much more in-depth, thorough explanation of all these laws and what is legal when constructing your pond. So let's switch gears a little bit and talk about water quality. Now, water quality can be determined through previous water quality reports acquired by the landowner using a field testing kit or by submitting a water sample to one of the Texas A&M laboratories. There's also many private pond and lake management companies that you can go to and private labs as well. Okay. Now, when we look at this, first of all, we want to caution people to avoid using things like aquarium test kits, pool test kits, and by far, if it is one of those, if anybody's seen those little quick dip test strips where you just dip a little strip and you get a color change, when you look at the range of error in those, most of those jump 50 parts per million per interval. So you could be extremely far off. You can say, okay, well, this test strip says that I have, a alkalinity of 50, but that can range anywhere from 0 to 100 because that's the error on it. And so at 0, nothing is going to live in that water, but at 100, you're in the optimal range. 50 would be acceptable, but you don't really know where you are. So use a little bit better quality kit. Most landowners can spend about $300 to $600, depending on the company. There's many of them out there to buy home testing kits. Like I said, most of these kits are either drop titration or you add powdered reagents from a packet and you get a color change that you need to interpret. Most of those kits, when you buy them, like I said, since they're drop titration, they usually are good for about 100 tests each. Some cases, they only sell 50 tests each, but it's typically 100 tests each. Or you can actually send out to, say, one of our Texas A&M labs. You can get a complete test done for you professionally using high-end equipment with very little error for about $40. So a lot of people, tend to just use a professional lab, whether it be one of ours or a pond and lake management company or a private lab. Tends to be more economical and easier for the client. So water quality is literally the most overlooked aspect of pond management. It's critical to supporting the quality fishery, limiting nuisance aquatic vegetation growth, and supporting the health of livestock and wildlife that consume it. So what we need to do to identify potential issues with water quality is the water chemistry levels may determine what chemical treatments will be effective, what fish species you can stock. Yes, that's right. If the water quality is incorrect, you may not be able to go with the typical bass, bluegill, channel catfish. You may need to look at a different stocking strategy. We often run into people in the Permian Basin that have high saline groundwaters or along the coast where we'll actually go with a red drum, hybrid striped bass, Atlantic croaker, threadfin shad stocking strategy because it's more like a marine environment. So there may be differences in stocking strategies. But it can also affect your lining rates and your fertilization rates if you're running a fertilization program. You need to determine water temperature and consider the time of the year. You need water temperatures below 65 degrees. Most of our aquatic vegetation in Texas will still be in dormancy or not actively growing. So management options like chemical control may not be effective. So there's one of those times when temperature comes into play. At water temperatures above 85 degrees, it is not safe to haul, stock, or handle fish. It's also not safe to treat aquatic vegetation in ponds containing fish due to dissolved oxygen concerns. Alkalinity, pH, and hardness are your keys to your fishery, so you definitely need to know those. And so this is just a quick little infographic about the Aquatic Diagnostic Lab. This lab's relatively new. It hasn't existed that long, but as you can see from 2021 here to 2023, our services were valued at 28.3 million. We tested water for 334 acre feet of commercial aquaculture, 65,000 feet of private water impoundments. We treated $2.2 million worth of commercially raised food fish. So, in that essentially 3 year period, we did quite a decent business for a new lab. Well, look at our 2024 impacts. We're already at 19,000 acre feet of private waters managed, 16.76 million in clientele estimated value of fish and water resources managed by the lab. We've had 12 cases of livestock deaths and 9 cases of fish kills due to cyanotoxins resolved by our lab this year. 18.67 million in estimated value of total resources managed by our lab. So our lab is quickly growing and we're having tons of clients every year. So in terms of fisheries, one of the first things you need to do is assess the fish population and species present. Now, maybe it's a pond that there are no fish present. Even if you've never stocked it, you still need to take this step because fish enter ponds in many ways. Oftentimes, it's our fellow human beings. Honestly, if there is a mud puddle in a Walmart parking lot, someone at some point in time is going to feel the need to put a fish in there. So we get bait bucket introductions. We get fish washing in from up ponds and lakes upstream on the same watershed during high water events. We have wildlife transporting eggs and larvae. So there's many ways what fish can get in your pond. And oftentimes what we see is you're not stocking them. It's usually undesirable species that end up in your pond. So stocking can be an expensive endeavor, but once stocked, most ponds only need managed, not restocked. Typically, depending on what species combination you're stocking and the particular sizes, this can vary, but typically it's going to run between $650 and $850 per acre to stock your pond. So it's not a cheap endeavor or undertaking. Now, species stocking and management goals determine the cost. We also need to make sure that we're keeping good records. Record keeping of catch and harvest is of critical importance in pond management because it is a small body of water. We need to know what goes in and what comes out to make sure that fish population stays balanced. Unfortunately, many pond owners do not know this until a problem arises, and they may not have any records to share regarding the fish population. So if you call in a professional to come assist you after you've had a fish kill or you've got a stunted fish population or a species has disappeared and you don't have any records, there's not a whole lot we can tell you about the history of that pond, the fish population and the collapse when we have no data. All we can tell you is the picture that we see in front of us at that point in time, not what caused that picture to happen. So, how can the fish population present be assessed in your pond? Well, seining is the preferred method. However, we realize that seining is not always practical. Seining the shallows, especially in early summer after spawning has occurred, is great because that's the time that you get to see young of the year so that we make sure that all of our species are reproducing. There's active reproduction. We're having recruitment to that fishery, but the smaller fish are also easier to capture. You get a better idea of the number estimates, and you're also going to be able to find the diversity of species present. So we'll find bluegill, red ear, you may find undesirable species like bullhead or young in the year carp, other types of things. But seining requires a minimum of two people. Oftentimes, you are working alone. You don't have another person to work with you. Um, Also, the slope of many ponds makes it detrimental, or the vegetation in ponds makes it impossible to seine. So seining is not always practical, but it is the preferred method if you can do it. Cast nets are easier to operate for a single person, but catch rates can be variable based upon operator skill and experience. So it does take some learning curve to get good with a cast net, but one person can do it. Fish traps can be useful in catching and identifying smaller species of fish, but do require the person to return to the site multiple times to set and collect traps. Typically, you're going to set traps late in the evening, allow them to set overnight, and you must return the next day to see what you've got in the traps. Unfortunately, it's often necessary to rely on previous pond owner for most information other than what can be seen or self-measured. When you're purchasing a property or moving to a property, ask for all stocking and harvest records or what species were recently stocked into that pond so that at least you've got some records and some documentation and you've got an idea of what's going on in your pond. Ask what species have been caught and released, as well as how many of each species have been harvested. This is going to help you assess the fish population and if adequate harvest has been occurring to keep that population healthy and growing. Okay, going to shift back over to Brittany real quick.
Okay, so aquatic vegetation is a really large issue no matter, what you're managing your pond for, right? So whether it's livestock, a fisheries, irrigation, aquatic vegetation can really, either hinder your operation or maybe for some reasons, for erosion control or nutrient buffers, which we're going to touch on a little bit, can help. And so why is management needed for aquatic vegetation? So kind of some of the main ones that might pop in your head just seeing these photos are aesthetic reasons, these floating mats, they look kind of goopy, right? You don't want to swim in areas that look like that. Another issue is they can cause low dissolved oxygen issues. And so a lot of our vegetation, even though it produces oxygen during the day, it consumes oxygen at night through their process of respiration. And that can result in you waking up in the morning and seeing that your fish have died. And so it's a very common occurrence that we see here in Texas. It may also limit recreation. I talked about swimming, but thinking about fishing, getting a pole in the water when you have a lot of dense vegetation can be an issue. It can clog irrigation pipes. That's another big one with a lot of our uses that we see around Texas. And so a lot of the questions we get right off the bat is how much is too much? So how do we know if something is a problem? And so typically when we're talking about vegetation that is in the pond, okay, we're talking about 20% or less coverage of a pond's area should have aquatic vegetation. There is documented evidence, scientific research that backs that after you get about 30% coverage of aquatic vegetation in a pond, a lot of your aquatic organisms will be affected and your wildlife as well. And so all this is to say is not all aquatic vegetation is bad. We do want to limit what's actually in that water column. But for example, we got a question last night about shoreline vegetation. Shoreline vegetation is great. There's not a certain percent coverage that we would recommend in terms of how much shoreline vegetation around your pond, right? It's useful for erosion, for nutrient uptake. And so it really just depends on your goal. So obviously, if you're going in and if you're having access issues, then you would want to go in and manage your shoreline vegetation. So just take that into account when you're looking at your overall pond. Okay, how much coverage do we have in the pond? Then look at the surrounding area and seeing how it's maybe not matching up with your goals. We do say that you should try to avoid woody vegetation surrounding a pond just because they can really mess with the integrity of the pond and maybe later on down the line cause some leaking issues. And so in terms of overgrowth, so if your pond looks like one of these pictures here on this slide, they can really be related back to increased nutrient input. So your ponds are nutrient sinks over time. They're slowly accumulating nutrients. When your water evaporates, those nutrients are not evaporating with that water. They're staying in there. They're getting concentrated. So think about this anytime you're doing a management practice, on your property, whether it's fertilizing your pasture, if you have livestock going in and out of the water, that's going to contribute to your aquatic vegetation. Also, increased water clarity or sunlight reaching the pond bottom. A clear pond is not necessarily a good pond, right? And so the more water clarity you have, the more sunlight you have hitting that pond bottom, and the more aquatic vegetation you're going to have. So if you're someone that wants that clear fishbowl looking pond, be expected that probably you're going to have some issues coming up with aquatic vegetation that are going to be something what you see in these photos over here on the right. We do have an aquatic vegetation prevention fact sheet that you can look at a little bit more in depth, especially going into the spring months. And so when we start talking about aquatic vegetation, I mentioned it before, the first step in management is ID. And so if you are someone that is using our resource, our aqua plant, or if you're sending photos to your agent or to myself or whoever, do yourself a favor, do us a favor, kind of make sure that you are taking high quality photos. It's really hard, even if you are using these photos yourself to kind of reference and use aquaplant, it's going to be really hard if everything's clumped together, or if it's at a distance, the vegetation's still in the water, or if plants aren't separated. You're not going to get a good ID, which means that you're not really going to come up with an effective management plan for the most part. And so what we recommend is taking the plant out of the water, spreading it out, okay? So separating it, making sure that, plants that look, similar are together. And then if you think it's another plant, put it, in another pile for another photo. Spread it out, make sure it's in focus. You can put it next to a scale item. That would be helpful. It doesn't always have to be a ruler. It can be a coin. It could be your hand. And then make sure it's against a contrasting background. We usually recommend a white or light colored background. So maybe using your truck hood, maybe using the top of a cooler. You can get creative, right? Just based on what you have with you. But this really helps and goes a long way. And it helps prevent you from coming up with a management plan or getting a management plan that maybe isn't tailored to your particular issue. So just to quickly go over some of the different types of control that are used to combat aquatic vegetation. We have our physical and cultural controls. So this is just altering the environment rather than using direct controls. And so we're typically using these as prevention strategies. So an example of this is pond dyes. And so these are basically non-toxic dyes, very similar to food coloring that you use, right, in the kitchen. And so this would be added in to help decrease water clarity and overall decrease that aquatic vegetation that's able to establish, or the areas that aquatic vegetation is able to establish. You'll see this in a lot of our recreational ponds, HOAs, golf courses, because it also enhances aesthetics, right? There's many different colors out on the market. Not going to get too into it. But if this is something you're trying to put into your pond, especially as we're entering again into these spring months when you should be thinking about prevention, you do need to know the approximate average depth. Some of those fundamentals that Dr. Sink went over are very pertinent throughout all of your management. Some pond dyes actually come with a 2-in-1 and include a beneficial bacteria blend. So this will help you out. But if it's a 2-in-1 product, just make sure that you're being mindful of the water temperature when you're adding it in. You want to be adding it in when your water temperatures are about 65 degrees Fahrenheit. If you add it in too soon with those beneficial products, you're really not getting kind of the use of that type of dye, if that or the use of that aspect of that dye. You'll kind of just be using it similar to if you just had a pond dye product with nothing else added in. These are a relatively cheap type of prevention strategy. It runs you about $15 to $25 per acre foot for your initial application. And then you would be doing follow-up applications as needed every 1 to 2 months. And so essentially you would be looking at your pond, and if your water is clearing up, whether it be, maybe the pond dye, it does naturally break down, or maybe you had a large rain, be mindful of that and make sure that you're going back in and bumping it up to where you want it. Mechanical control. So these larger pieces of equipment are not mass produced, but I do like to cover them because we get a lot of questions on them in terms of companies coming out wanting to use them, or we get a lot of questions about people wanting to rent these. Maybe they're trying to avoid chemical control or other types of control. Just know that when you're using or looking at each type of control, it's highly dependent on vegetation type, it's dependent on the density. When we're specifically talking about mechanical harvesters or mechanical control, the more dense something is, the longer it's going to take for them, the more root systems in the sediment, it's going to mean, the longer amount of time it's going to take to be able to remove it through this type of control. And so you'll see more of our traditional harvesters on the top. Typically, they can cover about 1 to 1.5 surface acres. And in order to have a company come out and do this is about $1,600 to $1,800 per day. There's some differences between the two, just in terms of how much equipment needs to come out and how you're removing the vegetation. For example, our amphibious machines on the bottom, this is an example of one of the newer machines on the market, is a truckser, and it can go right from land into the water rather than, what you see at the top where someone needs to haul in a piece of equipment, which can be kind of difficult depending on how, your landscape is, how your pond's structured, to make sure that, they can safely drop that machine into the water. The more amphibious machines go from land directly into the water. They're a little bit pricier to have someone come out and use this equipment, and it can take them a day to do about a half to 1 surface acre, again, just depending on the type of vegetation. For example, if it's cattails and if they're going in and they're removing each of the individual plants, that's going to take a lot longer than something that is free floating in the water. Okay, I want to quickly mention some of our biological control options. And so for aquatic vegetation, we're primarily limited to herbivorous fish for our main biological controls. And so one of these, we have our triploid grass carp. These are typically used to control soft submerged species, so vegetation that's in the water. They're not going to jump out of the water and control your cattails, right, on the bank. You need a permit from Texas Parks and Wildlife to stock triploid grass carp. So you can visit their website in order to purchase, or you get the permit, and then you will need to purchase from a permitted vendor, which they actually provide you with a list once you acquire that permit from TPWD. And we have a fact sheet on that if this is something that you're interested in, because there are some caveats. So to get a permit, you do need to make sure that you have an escapement barrier built on any of your inflows or your outflows. And you should just probably know some of the background information of triploid grass carp before you introduce them to your pond. For example, they can live 10 plus years in your pond, but they're only going to be effective to control aquatic vegetation for about the first 5 to 7 years. And so the fact sheet that is up here on this screen kind of goes over that. It's only about 5 pages, but it gives you some more information. Then we have our Mozambique tilapia. These typically control more of our algae and floating species, so our aquatic vegetation that stays up towards the top of the water. You do need to expect that they will die off naturally in colder water temperatures. And if you are look at this map here on the left-hand side, if you are in the green region of the state, you will need to get approval from TPWD. If you are in the blue region, you do not need approval. You just need to make sure that you're purchasing from a permitted dealer. We do also have a fact sheet on Mozambique tilapia, and it links to some other resources. So again, you can look at more information. Also in these publications, we talk about species that they're effective at controlling. So I have one here at the top right-hand side. This is duckweed. We have multiple species of duckweed in Texas, and statewide, it is an issue. And so this could be one potential control option. Chemical control, we get a lot of questions on chemical control. Prices vary significantly depending on the active ingredient, the formulation, location, time of the year, target species, and application type. So highly variable. Most of our landowners do kind of lean more towards our contact herbicides just because they're relatively cheaper and more widely available. A lot of our contact herbicides are used on things in the water, so algae, floating species on the surface, and vegetation that is rooted underneath the water surface. Our contact herbicides are typically good for spot treatments around docks and when vegetation's first beginning to establish as well. And when you're using a contact herbicide, just expect that multiple applications will be necessary because it only causes above ground tissue death. It really doesn't get into any of the roots or reproductive structures. So here's just some examples of common contact herbicides that you've probably heard of. You've gone to any local feed stores, they probably have them. So copper sulfate, chelated copper complexes, and diquat. We also have on the other end our systemic herbicides. These are typically used on some of our submerged vegetation that's a little bit harder to get rid of. And then also our shoreline vegetation. So think of cattails, think of rushes, sedges, and they do cause total plant mortality when effectively applied. So they do get into those root structures, those reproductive structures. And so examples of these are glyphosate, 2,4-D, imazapyr, fluoridone. 2,4-D is the only state limited use pesticide that can be aquatically labeled, but you would still follow the same regulations that you would if you were going to apply 2,4-D on your fence line or your pasture. And we have an aquatic herbicides table that was recently updated this year that has all of the active ingredients that can be aquatically labeled. That's really important when you're using chemical control in the aquatics realm. Make sure that it is properly labeled for aquatic use. It's right there, the first page of a herbicide label. And so we have this resource. It's a 4-page document, and on the 3rd page we have common trade names for each of the active ingredients that can be aquatically labeled. I also wanted to include this in here. All aquatic vegetation is not bad. You definitely want some aquatic vegetation surrounding the edges of the pond. You don't want a completely barren area like you see at the top there. You want to help prevent, again, erosion and nutrient runoff. And so things like creating a nutrient buffer would be highly beneficial. It doesn't need to be completely around the edges of the pond, but in areas that receive a lot of runoff, it can be very beneficial. We also have a resource on how you can create a buffer for Texas ponds, and we have a species guide just because I can throw up species, throw species on the screen all day. And it really just depends on your specific goals. Are you doing it for habitat management, nutrient mitigation, erosion control, aesthetics? And we kind of have that all listed in that really quick resource, but it is a very large component. Again, you don't want to make your pond a completely clear fish bowl, and it can help you in the long run. So this is just going over some of the considerations, basically planning every 3 to 6 feet, depending on how quickly you want to establish something, and making sure that you're doing this in the early spring, rather than trying to do this, this time of the year or anything like that. On the Aquaplant website, we do have a list of aquatic plant nurseries if you're wondering where to get some of these species. And so I wanted to point that out as well. Okay, so this is kind of the conclusion. I'll let Todd go over some of our final thoughts.
Sure, thank you, Brittany. Um, just to reiterate a couple of points that we try to make throughout this. So, as we already mentioned, there's 1.3 million ponds in Texas, and we're growing at a rate of about 30,000 ponds a year. And so there's some interesting data out there. The Texas Real Estate Center found that ponds add $4,500 in value for each surface acre. And so a lot of people really see ponds as a way to add value to a property. The issue is, unless you are properly maintaining those ponds and doing what you need to do, the annual management costs can far exceed $4,500 annually if not construct and maintain and manage property. So while they may add value to your property in terms of your financial cash flow on property, they can be a very expensive debt. We want to make the clear point that ponds are not natural environments. They are not natural. They are all man-made. And so there is no such thing as a natural pond habitat. We get so many calls that people want us to tell them how to set up a naturally self-sustaining environment in a pond. It cannot be done because it's not a natural environment. You must adopt the attitude you have just constructed a giant outdoor aquarium. Aquariums take a lot of work, effort, and management in order to keep that ecosystem functioning properly. It's no different for your pond. Management is continuous. You cannot manage a pond 1 year and then ignore it for 3 or 4 years and come back and think it's going to be in good health. It simply is not. You need to continuously manage. And another point that we like to make, there's many people that like an aesthetic pond, mowed perfectly to the edge. They want clear water that they can see down 12 foot deep. The issue is a aesthetic pond is not always a productive or desirable state for a pond. If you have a very clear pond that has mowed right to the edge, that means there's probably very little food content in that water column. You're not going to have a good fishery. It's not going to support much in the way of wildlife. There's no food value there for wildlife. You're going to have nutrient issues eventually with that mowing. So just making a pond aesthetically pleasing is not always the best case scenario. And so most of the stuff that we cover today, you can find in this resource right here, a Landowner's Guide to Aquatic Site Visits. So if we talk through some of this stuff really fast, or we did have to gloss over some things and skip some stuff, this is a really in-depth guide with this little checklist that helps you go through and document all these things that we covered today for your pond so that you can start to build your own management plan based on your goals. And if you need it, then this is a great piece of information that you can go to hand to a professional that they can immediately jump in and not have to repeat all this process and help you start developing your management plan for your pond. And with that, we'd like to thank you for attending. And I'm sorry we kind of ran a little long there, so we'll get to any questions.